The sunflowers went up against the cabin walls in the second week of October, and the Fenner settlement had made its assessment of this fact before the week was out. The assessment was not hostile. It was the mildly affectionate variety of judgment that a small community reserves for the harmless eccentricities of people. It has otherwise decided to approve of the kind of judgment that says, in effect, that a person has every right to do something puzzling as long as they are otherwise unremarkable in their community membership, and their debts are current. Margret Lund was unremarkable in her community membership. Her debts were current, and the sunflowers going up against the cabin walls, the dried stalks bundled and lashed to the exterior timbers in the dense, overlapping configuration that she had been working on since the first frost took the garden in late September, were, by the settlement's collective reading, decoration. The kind of thing a woman does when the functional demands of the season have been met, and there is still something in her that wants the place to look like something has been thought about it. The settlement found this charming. It did not find it practical, because practical was a category the settlement reserved for things it understood, and what Margret Lund was doing to the exterior of her cabin was not a thing it understood. She was 52 years old, a Norwegian-born widow who had come to the Fenner settlement 12 years before with her husband Lars, and who had remained after his death 7 years ago with the specific quiet determination of a woman who has decided that the life she built in a place belongs to that place, and not to the circumstances that altered it. She kept a modest operation, kitchen garden, small flock of chickens, the milk cow she called Ingrid that the settlement's children had been visiting since it arrived as a calf, and she managed it with the methodical sufficiency that 7 years of single management had produced. She was also, though the settlement had not had occasion to note this, the daughter of a woman who had grown up in the farming communities of southern Norway, where the winters were not the polite cold of a moderate climate, but the serious cold of a place that required its residents to develop, across generations, a relationship with the available materials that made the difference between managing and not managing measurable in lives rather than comfort. Her mother had insulated with what was available. In the southern Norwegian farming communities of her mother's youth, what was available in autumn, after the grain harvest, after the garden was in, after the root cellar was stocked, was the stalks of the tall-growing plants that the summer had produced, and that the autumn had dried into the specific dense, hollow-stemmed material that a person who understood its properties recognized as something other than waste. Sunflower stalks. The hollow stem of a dried sunflower stalk is not the same material as solid wood or packed hay or any of the other insulating materials that frontier communities used against their cabin walls. It is a matrix of hollow chambers, each one sealed at the nodes where the leaves had been, each one trapping a column of still air that the winter could not reach because the column was enclosed on all sides by the fibrous wall of the stem. Still air is the insulator. The stalk is the container for the still air. Bundle enough stalks together and lash them against a cabin wall with the seed heads facing out, where they shed snow rather than absorbing it, and you have created, from the autumn's garden waste, a wall of insulating chambers that reduces the rate at which the cabin's heat escapes through the timber exterior by a margin that Margret's mother had experienced and described, and that Margret had grown up understanding the way children grow up understanding the things their environment requires them to know. She had grown sunflowers against the cabin's exterior since the second year on the claim. Not for decoration. For autumn. This year she had grown more than usual. The summer had been long and the stalks were tall, and the harvest had produced more dried material than her previous autumns, and she had bundled all of it and was lashing it to the north and west walls that the prevailing winter wind found first and hardest. The settlement watched from the road and reached its conclusion. She thanked the neighbors who stopped to comment and went back to the bundling. She had not yet told anyone what she was building, but she knew this the way a woman knows something she cannot yet prove. That the sky above the Fenner settlement was assembling with the patient industry of a northern winter preparing for a serious statement was going to make the explanation unnecessary. The winter would explain it. It always did. She worked the north wall first. The north wall was the wall the winter found earliest and most insistently, the face from which the January cold arrived without the softening that southern exposure or the windbreak of other structures provided. She had been banking the north wall with hay each autumn since the second year on the claim, and had found it helpful and insufficient. Helpful in the way that hay always helped and insufficient in the way that loose hay over time compressed and settled, and lost the air gap that was the mechanism of its insulating value. The sunflower stalks did not compress. That was the difference her mother had described, and the difference Margret had confirmed across 5 autumns of layering them against the wall. The hollow chambers of the dried stem maintained their structure under the weight of the stalks above them, the nodes providing the rigidity that prevented collapse, the bundle's collective mass creating a stable wall rather than a settling one. She lashed the bundles horizontally, working from the ground upward. Each bundle was approximately 6 inches in diameter, enough stalks to create a dense insulating mass, without so many that the weight of the bundle exceeded what the lashing could hold against the wind load that the north wall received. She overlapped each horizontal course over the one below it, the seed heads angled outward and slightly downward, so that the snow shed off the outer surface rather than collecting in the spaces between bundles. The seed heads were the detail the settlement had read as decoration. They were drainage. She completed the north wall in the first week of October and began the west wall, the secondary exposure, the wall that received the afternoon wind that came off the open prairie in the season when the wind shifted from summer southwest to winter northwest, and that was responsible for the cold infiltration she had noted coming through the west-facing door in the first and second winters before she had begun this practice. By the middle of October, both walls were done. She pressed her hand against the interior north wall on the morning of the 15th of October, when the overnight temperature had reached the first serious cold of the season, not winter cold, but the transitional cold that tells an experienced person what the winter is going to say, and felt what she felt every October when the stalks were in place. The interior wall was warmer than the outside air. Not warm, warmer. The difference between a surface that has been insulated and a surface that has not is not dramatic in isolation. It requires comparison to be understood, and the comparison available was the east wall, which she had not stacked this year because the east wall received the morning sun and managed its exposure with less difficulty. She pressed her hand against the east wall. Colder, measurably, immediately colder. She noted the comparison in the back of her household ledger, without elaboration. North wall insulated, east wall uninsulated, differential, significant, proceed. She was not ready to say anything to anyone. She was not in the habit of saying things before the evidence was available, and the winter was the evidence, and it had not yet arrived. The dog sat beside her at the north wall and did not have an opinion about insulation. She told him the winter was coming. He already knew. November came down from the northern prairie with the commitment of a season that has decided what it intends to be. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in the first week and did not come back up. The creek at the south end of the Fenner settlement froze along its margins and was solid through by the 14th. The families of the settlement settled into the winter management routine that Northern Plains living required, checking wood supplies, checking food stores, checking the structural integrity of anything that the winter would be testing, with the resigned efficiency of people who have done this before and know what it costs. Margret monitored her interior temperature each morning. She had no thermometer. Thermometers were a purchase she had made in her list of things to acquire next spring for the past 2 springs, and had not yet acquired because other purchases had been more urgent. What she had was the specific sensory knowledge of a woman who had lived in this cabin for 12 years, and who had spent 7 of those years tracking the morning interior temperature, by the specific feel of the air against her face when she rose and by the behavior of the dog, who had his own calibrated responses to cold that she had learned to read across 7 winters. The dog's responses in November of that year were different from the dog's responses in November of the previous year. He was less cold, not comfortable. He was a dog who slept near the stove regardless of the season, and his comfort threshold was generous. But the specific tenseness that cold produced in him, the drawing in that cold mornings created before she built the fire up, was less pronounced than she had observed in equivalent temperatures in previous years. She built smaller fires, not from economy, from the observation that smaller fires were sufficient, which was a different basis for the decision and a more important one. A fire built for sufficiency told her something about the structure's performance. A fire built for economy might have been telling her something about her own willingness to be cold. She was not willing to be cold. If smaller fires were sufficient, the structure was performing better than it had in equivalent temperatures in previous years. She tracked the wood consumption in the ledger. By the end of November, the figure was running 26% below her consumption for the same period in the 2 previous winters, controlled for temperature. Not exactly controlled. She did not have the thermometer, but controlled for the dog's behavior, which she had determined to be a sufficiently reliable proxy. A neighbor named Clara Hoft, who had the adjacent property, and whose cabin shared the same north-facing exposure that Margret's received, stopped at the fence line on a Monday in late November to ask whether Margret had any surplus firewood she would be willing to sell, because Clara's consumption had been running higher than expected, and the woodpile was not going to reach March at the current rate. Margret did not have surplus firewood. She had her own supply at its current consumption rate. She told Clara about the stalks. Clara looked at the north wall of Margret's cabin, the bundled sunflower stalks from ground to eave, the seed heads facing out, the horizontal courses overlapping in the configuration that Margret had been building since October, and she looked at it with the quality of attention of a person who has been looking at that wall since October and reading it as decoration, and is now being asked to read it differently. She asked how much difference it made. Margret told her, 26% less wood at equivalent temperatures, smaller morning fires, a dog who was demonstrably less cold. Clara looked at the stalks. Then she looked at her own cabin wall, the bare timber facing north, the chinking showing the weathering of a season, the specific exposure that she had been compensating for with the wood supply that was now running short. She asked where a person got enough sunflower stalks this late in the season. Margret said she had surplus from the garden she could spare if Clara wanted to start. Word was still moving before Clara reached her own gate. She could feel it the way a person feels weather before the clouds arrive. December arrived, and the blizzard arrived with it. Not on the 1st of December. The first week was the ordinary cold of a northern December, the kind that the settlement managed with the routine efficiency of people who had done this before. But the sky on the 8th of December had a quality that the experienced residents of the Fenner settlement recognized without being able to articulate precisely what they were recognizing: the specific color and texture of a sky that is not finished with what it is building. By the 10th of December, the building was apparent. The clouds came from the northwest in the configuration that preceded the significant events, and the temperature dropped 8 degrees on the evening of the 10th, in the specific rapid way that precedes snow rather than the gradual way that precedes sustained cold, and by morning of the 11th the Fenner settlement was in a blizzard. In the days between the sky's announcement and the blizzard's arrival, 5 neighbors had come to Margret's fence. Not all of them for the same reason. 2 had come because Clara Hoft had told them about the stalks, and they wanted to understand what they were looking at. One had come to ask whether she had surplus stalks to share. Two had come for the general purpose of checking on a neighbor before a storm, and had stayed because the stalk wall was visible from the gate, and they had questions. She answered all of them. She showed three of them how to lash the bundles: the horizontal course method, the seed head-out orientation, the overlap pattern, and spent part of 2 afternoons helping them bank whatever dried material they had available against their north walls before the storm made outdoor work impossible. It was not a complete application for any of them. A complete application required the full summer's growth of a planned planting, harvested and dried and bundled with the specific density she had developed across 5 autumns of practice. What the 3 neighbors managed in 2 afternoons before the blizzard was a partial application, enough to reduce their exposure, not enough to replicate what her north and west walls had achieved. Partial was better than nothing. The blizzard arrived on the morning of the 11th and did not relent until the evening of the 14th. 3 days and 3 nights of wind and snow at temperatures that the settlement would record in its collective memory as the benchmark for what serious winter meant in the Fenner country. Not unprecedented in the history of the plains, but severe enough that every structure in the settlement felt it and every resident understood by the end of the first night that the blizzard had intentions. Margret built her fire at the normal hour on the first morning. The normal fire, the fire she had been building since November at the reduced rate the stalk walls had made sufficient. She built it, and it was sufficient, and the interior temperature stabilized at the level she had established as her standard for the season. She checked the stalk bundles on the north wall through the door opening at midday on the second day, not by going outside, because outside was not a place the second day of this blizzard invited, but by opening the door and pressing her hand against the outer surface of the nearest bundle. Cold, the surface was cold. It was winter and the surface faced north, and of course it was cold. The interior wall was warm. The stalks between the cold surface and the warm interior were doing what hollow-stemmed plant stalks have been doing for the people who understood them, since before Margret's mother was born, trapping the still air that the winter could not reach, holding the cabin's warmth against the cold's pressure with the specific patience of a material that does not negotiate with what it is asked to resist. She closed the door and sat by the fire. She was, by the accounting of a woman who had been building this understanding across 5 autumns, exactly where she had planned to be. The blizzard broke on the evening of the 14th. Margret emerged on the morning of the 15th into the specific silence that follows a northern plains blizzard, the silence of a landscape that has been rearranged and has not yet resumed its sounds, the silence of 3 feet of new snow and still air, and the particular quality of cold that follows wind when the wind has stopped. She checked the stalk walls first. The bundles had held. Not perfectly. 2 of the lower course bundles on the west wall had shifted under the wind load of the 3rd night, the lashing stretched rather than broken, requiring retightening rather than replacement. She retightened them before she checked on the neighbors, because the wall that had been holding was more important to maintain than the walk she was about to take. Then she went to check the neighbors. Clara Hoft had managed. Her partial stalk application on the north wall had not achieved the full differential that Margret's complete installation produced, but it had reduced her wood consumption through the blizzard nights below what an uninsulated wall would have required, and she had come through the 3 days with her supply intact and her household warm. The 2 neighbors who had managed only minimal application before the storm had burned through their wood at rates that the 3 days had made uncomfortable. Not dangerous, they were sound and supplied, but uncomfortable in the way that a wood supply that is running faster than expected makes a person uncomfortable when the winter is not finished. The neighbor who had not banked at all, a man named Garrett Cole, who had been skeptical of the stalk method, with the specific skepticism of a man who does not require evidence before forming an opinion, and does not welcome evidence after forming one, had burned through a significant portion of his remaining supply across 3 blizzard nights, and was now doing arithmetic that the rest of the winter required him to complete accurately. He came to Margret's gate on the 16th of December. Not with his hat in his hand. Garrett Cole was not a hat-in-hand man by temperament. He came with the directness of a man who has arrived at a position through arithmetic rather than persuasion, and who considers arithmetic a legitimate basis for revising a prior position. He looked at the north wall. He asked how she built it. She told him. She told him the same way she had told Clara and the others: the horizontal bundling, the seed head-out orientation, the overlap, the lashing pattern, the importance of the bundle density for maintaining the air chambers rather than compressing them into solid mass. She told him that the sunflowers needed to be the tall-growing variety, because the shorter ornamental varieties did not produce the stem diameter and length that the building depth required. She told him that it needed to be planted in the spring to be ready in the autumn. He said he would plant in the spring. She said she would give him seed from this year's heads. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said the settlement had thought it was decoration. She said she knew. She noticed most things. She had noticed, in her mother's descriptions of southern Norwegian winter management, the specific mention of sunflower stalks as an insulating material that the farming communities there had used before manufactured alternatives made the knowledge unnecessary. She had noticed, in the Fenner settlement's first autumn, the exposed north wall of her cabin and the specific direction from which the prevailing winter wind arrived, and had understood that what her mother had described was applicable to what she was looking at. She had noticed, across 5 autumns of application, the annual confirmation that the stalks reduced her wood consumption by a measurable and consistent margin. She had not been lucky. The blizzard had tested every cabin in the Fenner settlement with the same impartial severity. What had not been equal was what the blizzard found on the north wall of the Lund cabin. 5 years of a practice carried across an ocean from the farming communities of southern Norway. Applied to the specific dimensions of a northern plains cabin and the specific hollow-stemmed material that the summer's garden produced in abundance, and that the settlement had been reading from the road as decoration. She was, for the first time in the 12 years since she had come to the Fenner settlement with Lars and had stayed after Lars, exactly where she had meant to be. Not finished. The spring planting needed planning, and the seed distribution needed organizing, and Garrett Cole's cabin needed stalks by next October, and several other cabins in the settlement were going to be asking the same question now that the blizzard had asked it for her. But placed correctly, with the knowledge that was hers and her mother's mothers before that, now moving through the Fenner settlement in the specific direction that useful knowledge moves when the season has demonstrated what it is useful for. Word was still moving. It had not stopped since Clara Hoft asked where a person gets enough sunflower stalks this late in the season. And in the spring, when the Fenner settlement's planting conversations included, for the first time in its history, the question of where to put the sunflowers, not for the county fair, not for decoration, but for October, more than a few of those conversations began with a reference to the north wall of the Lund cabin and the 3 blizzard nights that had settled the question of what the stalks were for. The winter had explained it. It always did.